Dunning, Maine, 1824. You will not find me frequenting the taverns and ballrooms so eagerly flocked to by others of my race, neither amidst peasants or those who might be called people of quality. I am a stranger to the shacks and mansions and hearts of others, which is much to my liking. How pitifully small is the mind that can occupy itself but little and compel its possessor to seek those of a like sort who require tireless quantities of external distraction, some social occupation of their thoughts. They are insipid and disingenuous, and desire the throng for to provide a supply of others to hate and lust for. No, I detest the common herd, and long for the things that they in their smallness have not the capacity even to contemplate. At the time in which this curious tale began, I dwelt, as I do still, in an old house in an old town, not far from the sea. Spring had come, though it was hesitant and damp, without flush of heat. The woodlands beyond my windows steeped in mist, and flowers ventured up in a quiet, almost apologetic way. Others may have found this a glum circumstance. Yet it suited me. I'll be bound, my spirit being in concert with all that is shaded and shrouded in fog. Yes, May had arrived at Dunning, though the season exerted itself without fervour. I had taken to the wood, and haunted the rocks by cold Atlantic grey. I had relished the rain that others might have shunned, and loosed my mind to roam the lonely places, friendless but for trees and fiddleheads and moss, and the cracked voice of a crow. It was my manner to stray from the road, better that I did not bear interference from fools about their ways. It was enough that I had occasion to stomach the company of that oaf Otis Bray, who brought me wood for the cooking and heating. He commonly put his tongue to no good use, blathering on about nothing rather than departing once I paid for the firewood, as would have been desirable. Bray was typical of those who found nothing so gratifying as crowding into noisy parlours and suffocating meeting-houses, and public houses rumbling with drunken laughter. Indeed, he would likely have perished if deprived of his cherished companions. Heaven forbid he should have suffered the dread torment of seclusion, the hollow, colourless void of his own dismal company. You will understand then why it is that I avoided the roads where I was like to encounter travellers and neighbours and bores like Otis Bray. One afternoon I was making my way home when I spotted, some distance away, a young woman from the village coming along the track. She had not noticed me, so I made quick into the trees and brush and hunched there until she made past. It was, you see, my inclination to hide myself, even from the very eyes of humanity. It may then come as a surprise to you, my listener, to hear that I once sought out a person to visit me at my home. It was not that I yearned for a caller, no, nothing of the sort. My reasons were admittedly selfish and had to do with secretive pursuits. Well, I will tell of them and make them secrets no more, and then perhaps you will come to see why I had want of a particular guest. I was the last of the Willows in these parts, and following the death of my uncle Fielding, I took ownership of his house and all that was within it, his strange books among the rest. Strange books, you wonder? What of these strange books? Well, have you known a book filled with a curious rust-coloured script that whispers when opened? Or a circular volume clad in covers of flattened silver that contains mysterious verses about the moon? Or a crumbling old tome with pages that never display the same passages twice? These are the items of which I speak, and upon taking their possession I became engrossed in the enigmas within. They became my very passion. I was an eager student of all that the books had to offer, and how deliriously queer were those contents! They told of other realms, places of ghostly wind and haunted song, and forests where dead birds yet flew, and flowers only boasted their blooms at night. They told of magnificent beings, unconfined by our mortal environs, creatures that dwelt in the shadow of all that is known. Perhaps, thought I, They were superior to the wretched lot of humankind. I had only to find a way to conjure them, to make possible entry into their world. I sought guidance of the books, and the instructions therein caused me to effect alterations to a room in my house, though some part of the whole was lacking. The books, for all they disclosed, were not without confounding riddles, which required me to rely in part on my own intellect and intuition and experimentation. Then, as luck would have it, if luck indeed it was, I heard tale of a young muralist who had come to Dunning, a man by the name of Salem Meeks. I had been about my rambling in the woods that clammy morning in May, when returning to the road I encountered Otis Bray, an odoriferous lump sitting at the reins of his wagon. The ogre was headed into the village with a load of firewood to deliver to the parsonage, if the godly man there could pry himself from his daughter long enough to pay the woodsman. Bray took note of me and brought his team to a halt. I grimaced. Against my wishes I was treated to an earful of gossip. Man is nothing if not a disgraceful beast. This is well known to me, and unlike the multitudes I care not to know of the specifics. But along with this and that scandal, Bray made mention of a stranger who had come to town meaning to make his fortune by the painting of murals in whatever house would have him. It seems he had travelled in New York and Massachusetts and New Hampshire, and was well regarded for his skills. Bray was pretty surprised when I asked him to fetch this Salem Meeks at the soonest possible time and bring him to my house. I took a coin from one of the little bags around my neck and tossed it to the lout. You will find that my rooms are not kept very bright, and that dust is allowed wherever it might accumulate. I have not the inclination to remove it, though one might think it a bloom of neglect dulling the fine skin of a fruit, for the house is a handsome thing, once a grand place with its finely carved woodwork. But I am not inclined to convention, and dust and cobwebs are hardly as offensive as artifice or the exhausting task of chit-chat, which is something that I prepared to endure while waiting for the muralist to come calling. There was still some light left to the day when Bray returned. His wagon was free of its load of wood, and a young man slavishly clad in the style of the day sat at his side. I stood outside waiting, dreading the prospect of having someone other than myself in my home. Meeks, who must have thought himself quite a dashing sight in his costly-looking top hat, removed body and possessions from the vehicle, after which Bray took his leave, headed for the nearest source of beer, no doubt. The travelling artist, with a brisk step and exhibiting a jaunty disposition, came to me and introduced himself. "Good evening, sir," he said. "I am Salem Meeks." I attempted with some effort to convey a sufficient pleasantness, though my exertion must have come across as merely polite rather than heartily sociable. Just as well, my goal was not to shine as a prized host. I disliked the man on sight, knew his kind from one keen sweep of my eye. His adherence to expected garment choices, as dictated by the whims of fashion, told me that he was no great thinker, not a man who dared against the common flow. His hair was both dark and curly about a face best called boyish. His garments were nothing like the grave old things I prized. The coat was short at the waist, long in the back, with rows of buttons shining like stars against rich blue fabric. Most annoyingly, he wore trousers, a type of covering that shall never know my legs. Entering the old manse, I produced something like an apology, lest Meeks find the dismal confines dislikable. Not many others, I should think, are fond of dust and dimness. In explanation I asserted that the woman who tends to the cleaning had been ill of late, while in fact no such person existed. The young man's cheer did not falter. In fact, he commented on the loveliness of the carved woodwork, and surprised me with his warm regard for the ancient furnishings, that many would have seen cleared away to make room for newer things. Not oblivious to social etiquette, I invited Meeks into the best of the parlours and sat him down, after I raised a cloud of dust by beating at one of the chairs with a handkerchief. I offered him tea, though I hoped that he would decline and spare me the chore. Tea, yes, That would be splendid, Mr. Willows. I twisted my face into a smile and left the room, sighing loudly once I was far enough away from his ears, and grumbled to myself as I prepared the tea. Upon returning, with the service on a tray, I found that Meeks had discovered my lute, a handsome old German thing, and had it in his lap. In fact, he was playing it. "I hope you don't mind," he said, grinning his boy grin. Indeed, I might very much have minded, as I abhorred the thought of others handling my possessions. But he was playing a mournful piece by John Dowland. I stood in the door, transfixed. "Lacrimae pavan," I noted. Meeks returned. "I know it to be flow my tears." "It is the very same," I explained, moving into the room and setting the tray on a table. "Written first for instruments alone. Only later were the sorrowful words put to it." He played well, I grant, the rich, haunting, hollow sound of the lute an almost tangible force in the room. His voice when he sang the opening of the song was pleasing as well, suitably melancholy. "Flow my tears, fall from your springs. Exiled forever, let me mourn. Where night's blackbird her sad infamy sings, there let me dwell forlorn." Not one to sing, I spoke the last verse when his playing reached that part in the piece. "Hark, you shadows that in darkness dwell, learn to contemn light. Happy, happy they that in hell feel not the world's despite." The final note trailed off into the air and the muralist smiled shyly. "You are fond of Dowland?" I asked. "Oh yes, and the lute as well. I had an uncle who taught me." "I cherish Dowland," I said, then added, "I'm not one for the noise that composers now produce." "New is not always better, is it?" Meeks asked, which seemed a funny thing coming from one who saw fit to clothe himself in the attire of the present rage. Meeks was proving to be a paradoxical character. Well, I had not brought this man into my house to discuss music and such, so I swiftly turned our conversation to my reason for summoning him. I needed a mural painted, I told Meeks plainly, but it was important to me that it be of the highest quality. At which time he produced proofs of his ability, a sketchbook, watercolours, and a locket of gold containing a miniature portrait of his deceased mother, which, he pointed out, was his most prized possession in all the world. I was greatly impressed. One would have thought an older, more seasoned hand had created the pictures before me, the portraits and landscapes and the delicate little rendering of his parent. Pleased with myself for having sought this artist, I offered, in addition to recompense for the work itself, to pay for his lodgings at the inn for the time required to craft the mural. Meeks was very happy with the arrangement. "That is very generous, Mr. Willows. Thank you." One picture more than the rest took hold of my imagination. It was a sketch that showed an old woman sitting out of doors with a small bird balanced on her finger. It was his mother, clearly. I recognized her from the face in the locket. "Is this fancy?" I asked, leaning over the work, looking at it intently. "Oh no," Meeks said with a laugh. "Often the birds would come to mother and take seed of her hand. I have done the same, having them light upon me." I felt a shiver. A fellow who feeds birds from the hand? The barbaric males in Dunning saw birds as things to shoot, for sport more than food. Perhaps this Salem Meeks was not so predictable as his fashionable exterior suggested. "Here is the room," I said, opening the door. Once a back parlour, the space designated for the mural was dark and vacant, with nothing on the walls but for whitewash, and that had not been refreshed in years. As mentioned, I had made some small changes to the compartment once the idea of enacting certain conjurations took place. All the furniture was gone for one, and the shutters were fast shut. But more than that, I had taken up chalk and made mystical symbols on the floorboards, though these I had wiped away, partly so that Meeks would not see them, and partly because they simply had not worked. My visitor inspected the room and seemed content with it. There was nothing to obstruct his movements there, and no wallpaper that needed to be removed to facilitate the application of paint. "It is not quite an ordinary landscape that I desire," I expounded, pacing slowly about in a circle, my hands behind my back, "but a landscape of morose beauty, rather like Dowland for the eye." Meeks smiled approvingly. "Well put, Mr. Willows. I believe I could do such a thing. I will certainly try my very best, at any rate, and if my work fails in making you happy, I will decline any payment. Does this proposition suit you?" I nodded, heartened by his integrity. "Indeed, Meeks, that will do fine." It was settled then. The work would begin the next morning. In the meantime the young man bade me good night and walked off for the tavern with something in hand from my purse to take care of his feeding and lodging. The visit had not been as dreadful as anticipated, but I found that outwardly extending myself had left me fatigued, and I was ever so glad to have the door closed and locked against the world. Meeks arrived punctually the next day and got to work directly. I left him to his business, not wishing to make distraction, nor to make conversation, being naturally inclined against discourse with my kind, whatever my opinion of this or that person might be. Besides, there was much to occupy my mind elsewhere. A surge of anticipation was rushing through my being at the prospect of seeing my designs come to light. Soon, providing all went well, I would bridge the way between this mortal rock and the numinous domain beyond. I had only to decipher more of the books and make sense of their conundrums so that I might know best how to use the mural chamber as a key to that other place, that province of greyness and wonders. I spent time between the covers of books and out in the seaside wood where greening and decay were about their unceasing minuet of contradictions. Life and sadness and beauty thrown together as if the lines of a dead, yet breathing poem. Salem Meeks made good progress transforming the walls of that downstairs room into a scene of gloomy splendour. He was a wizard with a brush, wielding his concoction of water and glue and pigment and whiting. It took him but a matter of days to complete the transformation. The muralist smiled in his boyish way when he presented the result of his labours. I think I may have smiled myself. "Is it to your liking?" Meeks asked. I stood at the centre of the room and turned slowly, marvelling at the forest landscape which before had dwelt only in dream, the brooding trees both emerging from and fading into a fog of grey. The scene was rendered in the style favoured by mural painters, wherein detail was only modestly applied, and the overall effect evoked a quality of starkness. "It is perfect," said I. "Simply perfect, Meeks." I was so pleased, so uncharacteristically magnanimous, that I invited Meeks to the best parlour for tea. I even allowed him to make music on my lute, some Dowland, which was splendid. My guest told of his travels in New England and beyond, and spoke of his painting techniques, which were of some interest. Again he showed me the very small painting he had made of his mother, and then encased in a gold locket. I listened far more than I spoke, though before he left, I did ask to have another look at the sketch of his mother with a bird sitting on her finger. Meeks put the locket down on the tea-table and opened his sheath of images. I was charmed by the scene. The seated old woman so much at peace, so in concert with the wild and natural, trusted by the creature that ought to have shunned the horrible pack of humanity. To think that the muralist Meeks likewise fed birds from the hand! The long arm of the clock had crept past 9, and my visitor revealed that he was required to start work on a new mural in another house come morning, and that he had best be on his way to the inn. Several others in town were eager to pay for his abilities, for which he was thankful. I paid him for the finished work. Indeed, I gave him a sum beyond that which had been discussed. He was very much delighted. At the door, Meeks said, "Thank you, Mr. Willows. It has been my great pleasure to make your acquaintance." I was struck with an awkwardness and could not hold his eye easily. Looking down, I muttered, "And my pleasure making yours." The ritual took place at midnight. I stood alone in the old parlour, surrounded by the painting of a lonely wood. Trees with black trunks and snaking limbs, and foliage of sombre green, receded into and emanated out from a grey haze that almost seemed to swirl in the glow of my single candle. Protected by a small bag of crushed herbs about my neck, I drew symbols in chalk, circles and snakes and lines that might have been twigs or lightning. I scattered pebbles and the clattering teeth of a fox, then petals from apple blossoms and feathers of varied size and shade. In the very centre of the room I shaped a face of mud with scallop shell eyes and hair of wilting ferns. I spoke the words the books taught me to speak, and, down like a beast on hands and knees, I bent to lightly kiss the muddy lips. The house made aching sounds about me, and the floor, or my limbs, shivered. All around the sullen trees appeared to list from side to side, and the greyness of the background seethed like smoke. I sat back on my haunches and lifted hands to the ceiling, which was painted black but for the pale bluish disk of a painted moon. "Damn!" I cursed. "Damn, damn!" I stormed through the house in a furious state, flailing my arms at the air, stomping my feet. Room to room I raged, my face hot and grimacing, my limbs trembling. I had failed once again, after all the experimentation, all the wishes and dreams, and the studying of ancient texts. Not even the mural had worked. I had failed in opening a passage to the fantastic provinces. In something of a fever I went out into the night, to the woods and the shore, where I stumbled and wept and here and there fell down, betrayed by unseen branches and driftwood like the legs of outsized spiders. Was I then condemned to spend my days in the sordid, reprehensible world of man? Morning came. I skulked out from the woods and travelled a short ways on the road, which was largely in shadow, for the sun had yet to make its way very high in the sky. The air was full of chill and birdsong as the grim oblong of my house reared up before of me. I came upon a most curious scene. There was that dim-witted Otis Bray standing by his waggon and horses directly in front of my house, the door of which hung open. I advanced hastily, my coat flapping behind. "What's all this about?" I snapped. Bray, who bent forward, peering into the building, startled and wheeled around. "Willows, you are not inside then?" "Clearly." "Who has opened my door?" "I could not say. We saw it come open." "We, did you say?" I inquired impatiently. "Who is we?" Bray gestured towards the gaping doorway. "Myself and that fellow Salem Meeks. Seems he forgot something at your house, a locket, and I agreed to take him here on my way to fetch wood." I remembered that Meeks had shown me the miniature painting of his mother the night previous. He had placed it on the table, and I don't know that he picked it up again. "The locket, yes," I spoke quickly, distractedly. "I'll fetch it. But where is Meeks?" "In there." Bray pointed into my house. "We was coming up the road and saw light fluttering in your every window, Mr. Willows, and the door flew open, and out came some terrible shrieks and a great quantity of smoke." "Well, it must be a fire," said Meeks, "and in he dashed for to save you." I squinted at the old house, which in my view seemed every bit intact. "I see no smoke," said I. "It has since stopped, but smoke there was, I swear it." I gave the man a cold eye. "You took the house to be afire and let young Meeks go in alone? What sort of coward are you? You might not have been so quick to go in had you but heard him cry out, and seen the thing that looked out at me from the doorway." I grabbed the idiot by the shirt. What, he cried out?" Bray swatted my hand away and took a step back. "Leave me be, Willows, I've had fright enough. What looked out the door? Are you sure it wasn't Meeks?" Bray shuddered. "Not Meeks, nor even a man. It was nothing of this world." The ritual apparently had not failed after all. I had been hasty in anticipating an instantaneous result. Lurching forward, I barked an order over my shoulder. "Take up your axe and follow me, Bray," and started up the steps towards the yawning doorway. "Meeks?" I called, my voice carrying off as if I had called into a cavern of chill stone. No voice called back. As for smoke, there was none, but the atmosphere in the house was peculiar in a way, and all that I looked upon showed as if seen through teary eyes. The entry porch was as it should be, but for the blurred aspect that I have made attempt to convey, and the best parlour looked to be in proper order when first I entered it, with Bray cowering behind me, and I easily found the golden locket that Meeks had forgotten. It was sitting on the tea-table, hidden by the cup he had left there, which I had yet to clear away. My mind was moving very quickly. How was it that Meeks had cried out? Had he come to some harm? Had I not opened a way into a realm sublime? Was it perhaps that I, the conjurer, the wizard, so to speak, was at ease to venture there and others were not? Was the muralist then in peril? Somehow I found myself glad for the little bag of protective herbs hanging about my neck. I took a start when Bray's weighty paw thumped on my shoulder and he barked, "Look there!" I did look, up at the ceiling, and saw a door, ordinary in every way but for the fact that it was overhead and had never been there before. The door opened outward a matter of inches, just enough for us to see that there was a blackness behind it, and that a bony hand with a brittle wrist had hold of the handle. The door sucked shut with a thud. Bray staggered back. "Was it Meeks? Was it he?" "Not Meeks," I muttered, and I lead the way out of the room. The change that had taken place was more evident now. A haze of blue light squeezed up between the planks of the floor as we crossed in front of the stairs and went into the second-best room. Perhaps, I reasoned, Meeks had gone in that parlour by mistake. The room was dark but for the weak glow stealing up through the floorboards, and the shadows that dominated there pulsed, as if those places where the light failed to extend were restlessly alive. The furnishings, as I knew them, were no more, but for a rocking-chair in which sat a grey slug as big as a sow, its glistening bulk tilting forward and back in the creaking chair, pierced with St. Sebastian's arrows. Bray gasped, dropped his axe, and bolted from the room. I could find neither Meeks nor Bray when I emerged, and the house I found was a place of strange sounds and sights. Doors existed where none had before, and these lead into shadowy rooms that opened into other shadowy rooms, and stretching hallways sheathed in cracked plaster, or draped with ghostly unravelling veils of lace. Soon I was lost in this uncharted maze that my dwelling had become. "Meeks, are you there?" I began to hear voices, but they were muffled, coming from behind or perhaps within the walls. Some rooms were less timid in their offerings of noise, such as one that contained nothing but for a dusty sheet spread across the floor and a single window which looked out upon an inky void. It came to my notice that shapes the size of small children were swelling up under the sheet. They stirred briefly, their little weeping voices icy in the ear. Then the lower half of the window took to flying up and down, producing the most unnerving laughter. Departing that compartment, I found myself in yet another lengthy passage, each side of which offered more doors, all of them sad, worn things with flaking paint. And smears of ashy colour. I dashed from door to door, from room to room. I saw wonders and horrors. You would think me mad were I to speak of them all. Have you seen a dripping, dangling gibbet stuffed with the rotting corpse of an enormous toad? A headless ant as big as a man seated and playing at a harpsichord, a table heaped with horse hooves, the awful mound crowned with a loaf of bread shaped as an infant, its doughy belly split open so that tendrils of luminous green sprout up and dance like wrack in a tide. I have seen these things, and more. I moved faster about my way, driven more urgently. I could hear other footsteps and called again for Meeks, and at last I heard him call back, "Mr. Willows, help me!" I made off in the direction of the voice, uncertain just from where it had come. "Meeks, where are you?" "Help me!" I ran, my feet and heart pounding, and flung myself through an open doorway into what had once been the back parlour, the room where I had enacted my magic. The walls were no more, and I was encircled, not by a painted landscape, but by the darkest, most forlorn of woodlands, where grey mist crept amidst shadowy trees and dead birds flew out from smothering clouds of foliage. A pale blue moon peered inscrutably through the branches as breezes sang the songs of ghosts, and queer flowers opened pale eyes to the darkness. It was the land described in my uncle's books. A figure stood before me on a carpet of grey grass, where recently I drew symbols in chalk on a wooden floor. It was Bray, and he seemed incapable of movement, his eyes glistening as he stared at me, his heavy arms hanging on either side of his bulk. "Meeks!" I shouted at Bray. "Where is Meeks?" "Perhaps they took him," he said, meaning to keep his voice low. "They?" I asked. Bray was not afforded the opportunity to make himself clear, for as I watched 3 figures floated up behind him, out from the depths of the woods. Each was coiled snugly in a dingy shroud that tapered about whatever legs it may have had, though spindly arms were free to swim in the air. Their heads, which lacked hair and features, were like eggs balanced on skinny necks, the shells sealed in a coat of rough textured plaster, and here and there jagged holes revealed what each possessed inside. One contained nothing but a solitary candle, while lightning bugs, flickering and floating, could be glimpsed through the few small gaps in another's. The one in the middle, which swam up and draped its skinny arms around Bray's neck, had only one opening, and tiny white birds with rusty nails poking out where they should have had eyes peeked out from within the darkness there. Before Bray could even scream, these 3 creatures had a hold of him, and whisked him off into the grey mist and the black air of that deep and impossible forest. So there you have my tale, though it has yet to arrive at its ending. While from the outside my house looks just as it has for many a year, it expands and alters itself continually on the inside, and contains a seemingly limitless span of foreboding and astonishing woods, and visitors beyond man's faulty ability to comprehend. I remain unharmed by the other occupants of my home. Indeed, nothing of a threatening nature has come my way, though they have proven dangerous. After Bray was swept off by those floating figures, I made attempt to follow through the wood, though my interest was in locating Meeks. All that I found of Bray were some clumps of hair snared in a briar, and one of his hefty feet, still encased in its shoe, tossed amongst a leprous bubbling of fungus at the base of a tree. I cannot say if I have made a mistake in bringing all this about. Can these strange beings possibly be so cruel and ignorant, so filled with greed and hatred as those humans who since their arrival on earth have slaughtered one another and made ruin of all that they put their hand upon? Time shall tell. But in the moment I fear for a fellow of a nature so gentle that he would feed a bird from his hand. Imagine such a lovely thing as that. The muralist is alive still, for I hear him call out now and again, and only yesterday I found his expensive black top hat lying beneath some dusky trees. And each day I roam the expanding maze of my house and search the boundless midnight woods, as I will continue to do, until I find my friend, Salem Meeks.